weeks ago, this is the spot on this crowded street where Umar Nabi, a doctor from Kashmir, blew up in his car, killing at least a dozen people. There's no sign of obvious tension or worry. People have gathered here in large numbers, but it also points to the abiding threat Delhi has faced for many, many years from terrorism. There have been blasts in this very area, and in this special episode of The Print Explorer, I'll be taking you a little bit further back to where the story actually started. 2 weeks ago, from this very parking lot outside the Red Fort, a young Kashmiri doctor drove his vehicle out onto the main road in front of me and blew himself up, killing more than a dozen people. Today, with the crowd and people gathered here for festivities to do with the martyrdom of a Sikh guru, there's no sign of obvious tension or worry. People have gathered here in large numbers, but it also points to the abiding threat Delhi has faced for many, many years from terrorism. There have been blasts in this very area, and in this special episode of The Print Explorer, I'll be taking you a little bit further back to where the story actually started, which is up in this fort after the time of the Emperor Aurangzeb, who died in the 18th century in 1707. We'll be looking at some of the backstory, how many waves of terrorists emerged from this very area and struck in this very city. And I'll be looking at the ideas that powered them over many, many centuries and eventually in the past couple of decades. To understand the story of homegrown terrorism, you have to think of it as a succession of waves or phases. First, you have the 18th century, where these ideas are invented as the Mughal Empire declines, and theologians think, how do we preserve Muslim power, Islamic power? You have a second phase where people like Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli go and actually fight jihad against the Sikh Empire. You have self-described jihads against the British at the time of 1857, the first war of independence. Then, after independence, things change. The first wave of homegrown jihadists, and I'll caveat that, uh, start with Sayyid Abdul Karim Tunda, who grew up nearby. It was homegrown, but if you like, watered and fertilized by the ISI, because many people in that phase, after the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 92, are thought to have gone to Pakistan for training. There's a second phase that starts after the Kargil war, when Pakistan starts sending jihadists to India, sending its own people, but soon realizes that's not a very sensible idea since they get easily caught. And you have a third phase that starts up with the Indian Mujahideen, who are young people from Uttar Pradesh, Delhi, and Karnataka, Bhatkal, Maharashtra, Bombay, who joined together to form a jihadist group. Again, some of their key bomb makers are trained, but most of them are youth from these cities who join up and who've come out of what was called the Students' Islamic Movement of India. They feel SIMI is all talk, no action, and they decide they want to act. Then you have a phase after the Indian Mujahideen packs up of Kashmiri jihadists being encouraged by the ISI to carry out attacks in India because they feel this is a waste of time. We are fighting an endless war we cannot win. The Indian army, the Indian border security forces and paramilitaries, the Jammu and Kashmir police, these are huge organizations, we can't beat them. But if we hit India in its cities, it will be different. So this succession of phases proceeds up to the tragic events we saw at Lal Killa. This much we know for a fact. Early in the morning, Umar al-Nabi drove to this city, to this very place, at 6:30 a.m. What he did in the hours after that, we're not sure. We know he stopped in this very parking lot, possibly right here, for up to 3 hours. There's speculation that this is where he loaded a bomb onto his car. We don't know that for a fact. But a few hours later in the evening, the car detonated just on the road outside. What his motives were, what he was thinking about, and why he did it, we're just not aware. Investigators are pouring through a massive evidence, including videos he made discussing suicide bombing and various clips of learning how to make explosives from the internet. But we can get some interesting clues as to what the thinking in his mind would have been just standing here. Imagine this place at the end of the last truly powerful Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb had tried to change this city and the way people lived in it. He'd imposed strict Sharia law, dictating everything down to the length of people's beards and how far their pants should reach, trying to stamp out drinking and the use of cannabis. And interestingly, he had very little success. Delhi's people aren't given to listening to the rules of people, whether they're the police or great emperors, and they simply defied these edicts. From contemporary accounts, we know that the religious police who roamed around in this area became almost a joke, with people saying even holy people in Delhi all smoke cannabis despite the emperor's edicts. But in the wake of Aurangzeb's fall, something very interesting happened. A cleric called Shah Waliullah, whose father had helped shape these religious laws and then given up on the whole thing, sat down and thought about how to defend the power of Islam at a time when Mughal influence and power across North India was waning. And the idea he came up with was religious reformation, was the idea of a strict purity of religious life, which would be fought for through jihad. Those ideas were to feed jihadists who've operated in North India for hundreds of years. There were jihadis in this area, self described in 1857. There were people who left this city to fight in what is today the Afghan borderlands in the 19th century. There were people who've carried those ideas forward in the last several decades, and we'll be looking at some of them today. On the left is the tomb of the theologian Shah Waliullah, who lived in Delhi shortly after the death of the Emperor Aurangzeb at a time of decline in the Mughal Empire's fortunes. Shah Waliullah was deeply concerned that Islam would fall into the background. His father had served on the Sharia committee of the court of Aurangzeb, had tried to frame Islamic rules for Delhi, but the people of Delhi were rebellious as they are now. They didn't listen to the emperor's diktats. An elaborate set of codes was drawn up, which dictated the length of people's beards, the length of their trousers, uh, what they could do and what they could not do, tried to stop them from drinking and smoking cannabis. But the joke used to be that even the holy people of this area used to keep smoking cannabis no matter what the emperor said or not. But anyway, Shah Waliullah framed the concept of jihad, which was to resonate through history over the next hundreds of years. It surfaced in Delhi during the rebellion of 1857 when various self described jihadis emerged from this city. Before that, with the legendary figure Shah Ismail, who fought in the mountains of Balakot in the Afghan Pakistan borderlands, was to inspire the Jaish e Mohammed leader Maulana Masood Azhar in the 1920s and so on. And when the strains in this city grew with the rise of the Ram Janambhoomi movement and later the demolition of the Babri Masjid, these ideas were to become very, very important again. A new cycle was to begin hundreds of years after the story began here. I brought you here to Shah Waliullah's cemetery outside Delhi. This is a really historic place, and it's important because this is where the idea, many hundreds of years ago, of jihad, of purifying the faith, of protecting Islam first began. Imagine this cemetery in 1707, at the end of the Emperor Aurangzeb's reign. A troubled time. He was the last of the truly powerful Mughal emperors. And a cleric called Shah Abdul Rahim, who'd served on his committee to enforce religious law, had more or less given up on the idea of enforcing religious codes, religious law, what some people call Sharia law. Shah Waliullah, his son, was a theologian who first came up with the idea that the faith needed to be defended and protected. He was no Democrat, mind. This is what he wrote. There would be three classes of men. I'm reading from the historian Irfan Habib. There would be three classes of men. First, those loyal outwardly and inwardly to the faith. Second, those who out of compulsion would conform to the faith and dare not oppose it. Third, the humiliated infidels. So, a reviver of the faith, but also the architect of the idea of fighting for it. And this idea, which was on the fringes of Delhi, outside the city, would resonate in there in the Red Fort. To my right is Chatta Lal Mia, one of the oldest neighborhoods on the fringes of Delhi. And it was in this neighborhood in 1946 that a man called Sayyid Abdul Karim was born, on the cusp of independence. Sayyid Abdul Karim was the critical figure in turning the theoretical ideas of jihad, which had been talked about and developed by Shah Waliullah, whose shrine we visited, into a course of action for a generation of homegrown jihadists. I first came to this street, Chatta Lal Mia, in the old city, decades ago, looking for the family of a man called Sayyid Abdul Karim. Abdul Karim Tunda, the police used to call him, because he'd blown one of his hands off, allegedly in a bomb-making accident near Tom in Alwar. I was telling you about how many ideas of jihadism flourished at the time of Aurangzeb and after, just up the road. But here, something very special happened. Sayyid Abdul Karim was born somewhere in this warren of houses in 1946 to a very poor family and had moved out by the early 1980s. Something happened in those years after he was born to shake Sayyid Abdul Karim's worldview. It's hard to say what that was. He was born in 1946, and in 1947, Delhi erupted in communal violence at the time of partition. This was the epicenter of much of that violence. In fact, some distance up the road, there are accusations that school kids were marched out and shot, terrible killings in the Old Delhi railway station not far away. Perhaps some of that influenced him. But then the story of partition violence, interesting in this part of the city, because there's also accounts of Muslims and Hindus who wanted to run away and leave, but their neighbors protected them. There's a wonderful book called Dindika Bitta, which talks about an ethnic lady who was Muslim, who stayed behind in one of the neighborhoods here, and the Hindu neighbors looked after her and were in fact insulted that she would think about leaving because they would protect her. Maybe that bitterness wasn't there. I don't know because he's never talked. What we do know is that Sayyid Abdul Karim first moved some distance away to Haryana and then on to Bhiwandi in Maharashtra. And in Bhiwandi, he's told police in testimony that cannot be admitted in a court of law because of Indian law. He claimed that he'd seen one of his relatives burned alive, people killed in the terrible communal violence of 1985. After 1985 and the terrible communal violence in Bhiwandi, Sayyid Abdul Karim first set himself up for religious study. He encountered the ideas of Shah Waliullah, the medieval theologian whose shrine they visited, and set up an organization called the Tanzim Islahul Muslimin, organization for the correction of Muslims. And like Shah Waliullah, he thought that the Muslims want to protect themselves in a communally fraught India. So they needed to correct their faith, become more pious, reject syncretic practices influenced by Hinduism, and set up what he thought and Shah Waliullah thought of as a pure Islam. But then the demolition of the Babri Masjid happened, and Sayyid Abdul Karim, along with a doctor called Dr. Jalis Ansari, a very well qualified and respected doctor in Bombay, decided to set off multiple explosions on intercity trains. The bombs weren't very big or lethal compared with the big bombings in Bombay conducted by the Dawoodi tribe in India just a year earlier. But this was to be a turning point. For the first time since independence, a group of homegrown terrorists had decided to attack targets in India. It had never happened before. Soon after those bombings, Dr. Jadis Ansari was arrested, but Sayyid Abdul Karim Tunda disappeared and ended up with the Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan. Sayyid Abdul Karim is now an 82-year-old man, 83. The trial for several of his cases has ended in his acquittal. The police couldn't really bring any evidence. He came back allegedly from Pakistan, through Nepal, into India, possibly tired of a life on the run, wanting to be back in his homeland. He's never given an interview about it. His family has never spoken about it, so it's hard to say. But there's only one case in which his trial remains. From 1996, Abdul Karim's recruits began to carry out a series of bombings that took place in Delhi, Rohtak, Sonipat, and Ghaziabad and ran until 1997. One of those bombs went off right here in the famous Roshan Ki Kulfi shop in Delhi's crowded Karol Bagh area. These bombings were rarely very lethal. They were made mostly with some homemade chemicals like potassium permanganate, but they were dangerous enough to really worry the security services. What was really disturbing about them is that the real perpetrators may never have been identified. The person alleged to have carried out the bombing here at Roshan the Kulfi, a resident of Azad Market, Delhi's Azad Market area called Amir Hashim, also alias Kamran, was eventually acquitted after years of trial, with the Delhi High Court's Judge R.S. Sodhi saying the prosecution had miserably failed to provide any evidence against him. In the case here, for example, there was one witness who said he'd seen Amir Hashim alias Kamran simply standing at the shop to maybe just as a customer. But that's hardly proof of terrorism. Other cases went the same way. As we mentioned, this wave of terror was homegrown but also supported by people outside. One of the more extraordinary cases was of a bombing that was supposed to have taken place on a bus. The Pakistani national alleged to have carried it out, Mohammad Zulfikar, was sentenced to death, but eventually let off by the Supreme Court in 2012. He was tried again acquitted a year later, and eventually sent home an innocent man. So as I said, these bombings raged on for a period, then flickered out, but we don't know who actually carried them out. Those same bombings are the ones today that Abdul Karim, now at the age of 82, is being tried for, but no conclusive proof on the perpetrators, the recruits, and the Lashkar-e-Taiba connections of this first phase of violence. By 2005, the Lashkar-e-Taiba's campaign had begun to peter out, at least as far as Delhi was concerned. There was an attack on the Red Fort, for which a Pakistani national is now facing the death penalty. But the Lashkar-e-Taiba realized that this was a high-cost, dangerous strategy in which its personnel were constantly caught, produced in court. The blame came on to the Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate. So, a lot of investment for, if you like, not so much bloody return. But something else had started happening that year. Starting with a bunch of low scale bombings outside the city. For the longest time, Indian intelligence officials thought this was part of the same terrorist enterprise run from Pakistan. But the story just didn't seem to be getting solved. The second wave, if you like, of homegrown terrorism came with an organization called the Indian Mujahideen. The Pakistani groups had more or less given up on their attacks after 2005, but a series of new attacks started, bombings all over the country, which seemed inexplicable. The police arrested great numbers of people, but the bombings went on. There were no clues. In 2005, there were terrible bombings in Sarojini Nagar Market, Lajpat Nagar, in Govindpuri, on a bus in Govindpuri, in which 59 people were killed. A Kashmiri medical sales representative was arrested for that attack. He would be acquitted a long time later. And in 2008, again, terrible bomb strikes in the city, unprecedented in their scale and lethality. There'd been attacks elsewhere in the country, in a number of which, including in Bombay, attacks on the suburban train system, in which, again, people were arrested, prosecuted, in some cases acquitted, in others convicted, but the bombings didn't stop. And then one afternoon, right here in these lanes behind me, there was a burst of fire and the case cracked open. In 2008, the story came to a bloody climax right here in the lanes behind me in Delhi's Batla House, in a neighborhood called Jamia Nagar, for those of you not familiar with the city. The Delhi police received information from the intelligence bureau that a terrorist was hiding out in this neighborhood. That terrorist turned out to be Atif Amin, a resident of Azamgarh who was studying in Delhi and who'd come into connection with a group of students who all had a background in an organization called the Students' Islamic Movement of India. SIMI, as it was called, became quite radicalized in around the time of 9/11 and the attacks, held conventions, but was banned. But the people who joined this organization were people who felt frustrated or felt that SIMI was all talk, no action, and they took it upon themselves to carry out these bombings. Fascinating thing is, after each attack, they sent email to newspaper offices saying that, look, we're not the Lashkar-e-Taiba, we're not a foreign organization, we are young Indians seeking revenge for the communal violence in Gujarat. Many of the people drawn into the ranks of the Indian Mujahideen were former members of an organization called the Students' Islamic Movement of India. The Students' Islamic Movement of India, or SIMI, started off as a student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami, Islamist political party, which still exists. Um, After the 1970s, SIMI became an increasingly independent organization and became more and more radical in its polemic. Uh, at their last convention in Bombay in 2001, there were posters up on the roads in praise of Osama bin Laden and saying and voicing support for the Taliban. But the people who joined the Indian Mujahideen were people who felt that SIMI was all talk and no action. And they wanted to do something violent to avenge the communal violence which had taken place earlier, but specifically after the 2002 violence in Gujarat. Even though the arrests of the Indian Mujahideen leadership after that shootout in Batla Nagar seemed to bring an end to the homegrown terrorism problem, it didn't quite go away. In 2011, there was a bombing at the Delhi High Court, which has been, which investigators from the National Investigation Agency have attributed to Kashmiri terrorists who have been convicted in the lower courts and cases are in appeal. Between 2011 and 2025, a long hiatus in attacks on the city, which has been broken with the tragic events at the Red Fort. What does the future hold? We can't say. But we do know Delhi as the national capital, as an icon of the country, and as a city always in the international eye, will be a target terrorists constantly seek to attack. 2 weeks ago, at this very place, tragic terrorist attack occurred, claiming the lives of a great many people. And as we've seen in today's episode, there have been a great number of other terrorist strikes on this city. People talk a lot about the resilience of Bombay, but this is a very resilient city too. And it's a hopeful city. Right here is the fort devoted to Mughal emperors past. The people behind me have come to commemorate the martyrdom of Guru Tegh Bahadur. There are Hindu temples and peoples of all communities gathering here, peacefully coexisting despite the many dark shadows that have cast themselves on this city in decades and centuries past. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to The Print Explorer. Thank you so much for joining this episode. I look forward to seeing your comments, questions online.